She was never really part of the business, my brother said to the board. His voice was measured, practiced. My sister-in-law sat beside him and nodded once. Her name on the founding documents was a clerical oversight, nothing more. I didn't respond. I didn't look at either of them. I kept my hands flat on the table and my eyes on the arbitration panel at the front of the room. Then the lead arbitrator set down her pen, looked over her reading glasses, and asked my brother's attorney a single question. "Counsel, are you telling this panel that you are genuinely unaware of who your client is sitting across from?" The attorney's hand stopped moving. The room went quiet, and for the first time since we had walked in, my brother turned to look at me. I had learned a long time ago that silence unsettles people who expect emotion, especially people who have spent years counting on your absence to rewrite the story. The conference room on the 14th floor of the arbitration center was nothing like the dramatic boardrooms people imagine. No skyline views, no leather chairs with brass rivets, just a long rectangular table, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, and a wall clock that clicked loud enough to track every second no one was speaking. My brother sat to my left with his attorney beside him. He wore a charcoal suit I didn't recognize, which meant he had bought it for this. He always dressed for the image he wanted to project, not the one he actually had. Composed. Reasonable. A man simply protecting what had been built. My sister-in-law sat one seat away from him. Her folder was color-tapped, organized, ready. She had that quality some people develop after years of managing appearances, the ability to look cooperative while being completely immovable. My attorney, a quiet woman named Patricia who had spent 15 years handling intellectual property and business disputes, sat to my right. She had reviewed every document I gave her without flinching. When we first met, she asked me one question before anything else. "What outcome matters most to you?" "Not money," I had said, "the record." She had nodded slowly and said, "Good, because that's the one they can't negotiate away." The arbitration panel consisted of 3 people. The lead arbitrator, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Kaller. Allison had a reputation for asking questions that sounded simple until you realized they weren't. The other 2 reviewed documents with the kind of focused stillness that meant they had already read everything and were waiting to see who would contradict themselves first. The case had been filed 6 weeks earlier, a dispute over founding attribution and intellectual property rights for a company called Vela Systems, a diagnostic software firm that my mother had started in her kitchen 11 years ago. I had been there from the beginning, writing code at the same table where she drafted business plans, learning her methodology, building the early architecture of what eventually became the company's core product. 3 years ago, my mother had died. 14 months ago, the founding records had been quietly amended. My name had been moved from co-founder to early contributor. The distinction sounds minor until you understand what it affects. Equity stakes, patent attribution, the ability to be recognized in licensing agreements, and the right to be named in the company's official history. No one called to tell me. I found out the way most people find out about things that were changed without them, indirectly. A journalist writing a profile on Vela's growth sent me a fact-checking email. She wanted to confirm my role. She referenced documents that described me as a former consultant. I read the email twice. Then I called Patricia. My brother's attorney opened the session with the same framing I had expected. He was experienced, controlled, the kind of litigator who believes precision of language is the same as precision of truth. He explained that the founding documents had been updated to better reflect the operational structure of the company at the time of incorporation. He explained that my contributions, while valued, had occurred during an informal period prior to the company's formal establishment. He used the word organic 4 times to describe the process, as if something that happens organically cannot also happen wrongly. He said I had been abroad during the critical years of the company's growth. That word again. Abroad. Cleaner than the truth, which was that I had been accepted into a competitive graduate research program in computational systems and had continued working remotely on Vela's core software architecture for 2 of those 3 years. My commits were in the repository. My communications were in the server logs. My name was on 3 provisional patents that had since been filed under the company's umbrella, or had been, before the amendments. My brother leaned forward slightly. The panel allowed him to speak. "My mother built this company," he said. "We all wanted to honor that. But the formal structure had to reflect who was actually present, who was managing operations, who was making decisions day to day." He paused. "My sister chose her own path. We respected that. But the company had to reflect reality." Then he said it. The sentence he must have tested in front of a mirror. "Her name on those documents is a carryover from early drafts. It doesn't represent the company as it actually became." A carryover. Clean. Surgical. Designed to make my existence feel like an accident of paperwork rather than a foundation of something real. My sister-in-law added quietly, "These clarifications happen in growing companies all the time. It's standard practice during maturation." I felt the air shift, not in the dramatic way. In the way air shifts when pressure is about to change direction. I didn't move. I had trained myself out of reactive motion years ago, partly by temperament, partly because in the kind of technical work I did, an impulsive decision cost more than a delayed one. "Doctor." Allison wrote something on her notepad. She flipped a page in the file in front of her. She looked up. "Counsel," she said to my brother's attorney, her voice carrying the same casual precision as someone pointing out a structural error in an otherwise clean design. "Are you telling this panel that you are genuinely unaware of who your client is sitting across from?" It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't theatrical. It was exact. The attorney's expression shifted by a fraction. Just enough to mean something. "Your Honor," he began, then corrected himself. "Dr. Tara Ellison, my client's sister, has had a distinguished academic career, and we don't dispute." "That wasn't my question," Dr. Ellison said. The room held still. "We'll take a brief recess," she said. 15 minutes. I want all parties to review the supplemental exhibit package my clerk is distributing now." Papers moved. Chairs shifted. My brother stood quickly and moved toward the hallway with his attorney, their voices dropping low and urgent the moment they cleared the doorframe. My sister-in-law gathered her folder, stood, and walked out without looking at me. Patricia leaned slightly toward me. "You okay?" "Yes," I said. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "They just handed us the framing." I knew that already. Standard practice during maturation was not a legal argument. It was a story, and stories fall apart the moment the documentation enters the room. I stood and walked to the window. 14 floors below, the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to what was happening in this room. I had been in more high-pressure environments than this. Dissertation defenses at institutions that did not give grace for imprecision. Research presentations where the panel had already decided you were wrong and was waiting to confirm it. Rooms where being the youngest and the only woman meant your competence was considered provisional until proven otherwise. I had learned in all of those rooms the same thing. Composure is not performance. It is infrastructure. You build it before you need it so it holds when the moment arrives. Across the hallway I could see my brother's reflection in the glass of a framed print. He stood with his arms crossed, jaw set, the posture of a man who had expected this to be resolved by now and was recalculating. He wasn't worried yet. He was annoyed. That too would change. I hadn't wanted to be here. Not like this. When my mother was alive, the question of credit and attribution had never been a source of conflict between us. She was meticulous about recognition. She had a habit of saying that the people who build things deserve to be attached to what they built, not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of record. Records protect you, she used to say, long after the people who remember are gone. After she died, I had given my brother space. Grief does different things to different people. He had always been closer to the operational side of the business, the client relationships, the sales cycles, the presentations. I had always been closer to the technical foundation. We were not the same kind of people, but we had been functional. I had assumed that would hold. The amendment surfaced 14 months after her death. Small at first, language adjustments in internal documents. Then, when the journalist's email arrived, I understood the scope of it. This had not been an oversight. It had been a renovation. A quiet one, the kind where you change what the house looks like without telling the people who helped pour the foundation. The first person I called after Patricia was someone who understood software systems the way I did. I asked him to help me reconstruct a complete timeline from the repository data, every commit, every branch, every documented contribution going back to the first functional prototype. What came back was not a surprise, it was confirmation. My contributions to the core architecture had not ended when I went abroad. They had continued for 26 months after my enrollment. The timestamps were clean. The commit messages were specific. The version history showed exactly who had written what and when. I also found something else. A folder in my mother's personal files that she had shared with me years earlier, labeled simply with the company name and the year of founding. Inside was a document she had drafted herself. Not a legal instrument. A founding narrative, a first-person account of how Vela began, who was present, and what each person had contributed. She had written it the way she wrote everything, directly, without sentiment, with the precision of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect. She had named me, not as an assistant, not as a consultant, as the person who built the architecture that everything else ran on. She had filed a copy with the attorney who handled her estate. No one had referenced it in the amendments. When Patricia and I had first gone through the document together, she had been quiet for a moment before speaking. "This doesn't close the case on its own," she said, "but it reframes everything." How? It shifts the question from what the records say to what was known when the records were changed. That's not administrative. That's intentional. That word had settled into me and stayed. When the recess ended, we returned to our seats. Dr. Spate. Allison's expression was unreadable, which I had learned meant she had already formed a view and was now testing it against what she was about to hear. My brother's attorney stood again. His posture had changed slightly, less expansive, more contained. "Dr. Ellison," he said, "we understand the panel has questions about the timeline of the amendments. We want to clarify that all changes were reviewed by counsel and signed by the company's managing director at the time of filing." "Who was the managing director at the time of filing?" Dr. Ellison asked. A pause. My client assumed that role following the passing of the original founder. Assumed it formally or functionally? Another pause. Shorter, but noticed. The transition was gradual. "I see." Dr. Ellison turned to my attorney. "Counsel, please proceed." Patricia stood. She did not begin with an argument. She began with a question. "Mr. Voss," she said, addressing my brother by name, "at the time the founding attribution was amended, were you aware of the existence of your mother's founding narrative document filed with her estate attorney?" My brother's jaw tightened. He looked at his attorney. "I'll need my client to—" "The question is directed at your client," Dr. Ellison said. My brother said, "I wasn't aware of every document in my mother's files." "That's not a yes or no," Patricia said gently. "I don't recall being specifically informed of that document," he said. Patricia nodded once, as if this were exactly what she had expected, and submitted 3 exhibits in sequence. The founding narrative, the repository timeline, a chain of emails between my brother's attorney and the company's records office showing the amendment request had been filed 11 months after my mother's death, and 7 months after I had sent my brother a message asking about the status of the company's IP filings. I had not accused anyone in that message. I had simply asked a question. 7 months later, my name had been revised. I watched my brother's face as the panel reviewed the documents. He was not a bad person. I had never believed that. He was a person who had made a decision and then built a structure around it to make the decision look like logic. That is different from malice. It is also not innocent. My sister-in-law spoke once, briefly, to say that the amendment process had been handled entirely through proper channels. "Dr. Kenneval." Allison thanked her and wrote something down. When the evidentiary portion concluded, Dr. Ellison looked at the 3 of us. "We will deliberate," she said. "All parties should be available for a ruling within 5 business days." She gathered her materials, stood, and as she moved toward the door, she paused. "One more question for the record," she said, not to the attorneys, but to the room. "The founding narrative submitted by the petitioner's late mother describes the technical architecture of Vela's core product. Is it the respondent's position that the company's current product line is materially different from that architecture? My brother's attorney began to answer. I'd prefer to hear from the managing director, Dr. Ellison said. My brother was quiet for 3 full seconds. No, he finally said. The architecture is the same. Dr. Ellison nodded once. Thank you, that's on the record now. She left. The room began to empty. My sister-in-law moved quickly, gathering her color-tapped folder, not looking at anyone. My brother stood more slowly. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, folded it over his arm, and then did something I had not expected. He looked at me, not with anger, not with the practiced reasonableness he had worn all morning, with something I could only identify as recognition, the kind that comes too late to be useful but arrives anyway. I returned the look and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the documents hadn't already said more clearly. He left. Patricia turned to me. That last question, she said quietly, was not procedural. No, I said. It wasn't. We walked out into the afternoon together and stood at the elevator bank. The building hummed around us, indifferent and efficient. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it honestly. Steady, I said. She pressed the elevator button. Most people in your position would have wanted to say something in there. Make a point. Let them know you knew. The documents said it better than I would have, I said. She smiled. That's exactly right. The ruling came 4 days later, not 5. Patricia called me at 7:30 in the morning, which told me before she spoke that it had gone the way the evidence pointed. Full restoration, she said. Co-founder attribution reinstated on all founding documents, patent records to be corrected within 30 days. The panel noted in the written ruling that the amendments were not consistent with the documented record of contribution and did not reflect the founder's stated intent. I sat with that for a moment. Was there anything about the narrative document? I asked. Yes, she said. It cited directly. The panel wrote that the founder's own account of the company's origins carries significant evidentiary weight and should have been incorporated into any material revision of attribution. It wasn't. That omission was characterized as consequential. I closed my eyes briefly. My mother had known even then. She had known that clarity was protection, that writing it down was not sentiment. It was defense. What are my brother's options? I asked. He can appeal, but the evidentiary record is clean. It's unlikely to go differently. She paused. He could also reach out directly. That part is up to you. I know, I said. Thank you, Patricia. You did the work, she said. I just filed the paperwork. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while. Coffee cooling beside me. City outside doing what cities do, moving without pause, without memory, without interest in any particular story happening inside any particular story happening inside any particular building. I thought about my mother, about the specific way she had of explaining problems, not by dramatizing them, but by diagramming them. She used to say that most conflicts weren't about what people said, they were about what the record showed after everyone stopped talking. She had been right. She had always been right about that. My brother called 3 weeks after the ruling. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I thought about what my mother would have done and answered. I handled it wrong, he said. There was no preamble, no warm-up. He had thought about how to say it and decided the shortest version was the one he could actually get through. Yes, I said. The attorney said it was cleaner to have one name on the operational documents. He stopped. I let myself believe that was about the company. It wasn't, I said. No. We were quiet for a moment. I didn't know about her letter, he said. The narrative document, I want you to know that. I had thought about whether I believed that. I had decided it was possible. People edit histories they are uncomfortable with, not always through action, sometimes through inattention, through choosing not to ask. I believe you didn't read it, I said carefully. That's its own kind of choice. He didn't argue with that. That told me something. What do you want to do now? He asked. I want the record to be accurate, I said. I already have that. And the company? I had thought about this too. Carefully, over several evenings with the documents spread in front of me and the city quiet outside. I don't want your seat at the table, I said. I want my name on what I built. That's separate from management, and I think we both know I was never going to be the person running client calls and sales cycles. That was always you. He exhaled, slowly. Mom used to say we were the same company running different operating systems, he said. She was right, I said. She usually was. We didn't talk for long after that. We didn't arrange a dinner or a phone call to process everything. Some things don't get unwound in a single conversation, but something shifted, not back to where it had been. Forward to wherever two people go when they stop pretending the past didn't happen. A month after the ruling was finalized, I did something I had been thinking about since before the case began. I established a small technical fellowship in my mother's name through a nonprofit that supported women in early-stage software development. The fellowship wasn't large. It was enough to fund one person per year for a 12-month build program, the kind of low-overhead, high-focus environment where people with good ideas and limited resources could actually finish something. I wrote the criteria myself. Preference would be given to applicants who are working on infrastructure, the unglamorous foundational work that no one notices until it's gone. My mother would have appreciated that specification. I didn't announce it. I didn't send a press release. I filed the paperwork with the foundation, deposited the initial funding, and noted the establishment date in my own records. There was no ceremony, just a document, clean and precise, saying this exists, this is why it exists, and this is who it's for. On a quiet Sunday not long after, I opened a folder I kept on my laptop that I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were things I had saved from the early days of Vela, screenshots of the first working prototype, an email thread between my mother and me from the year before the company formally incorporated, back when we were still calling it the project, back when the architecture was a framework written in a rented apartment on hardware she had bought refurbished. At the bottom of the folder was a file labeled simply First Demo, her notes. I opened it. Her handwriting, photographed and scanned. A list of technical observations from the night we had run the first real test of the system. Short, specific, practical. At the bottom of the page in the margin, she had written one line, not technical, not procedural. She built this. Don't let anyone forget. I closed the file and sat with it for a long time. People sometimes ask what winning looks like in situations like this. They expect the answer to involve confrontation, a moment where someone breaks down, a scene where the truth lands loudly. That's not what it looks like. It looks like a record being corrected, quietly, permanently, in language that will exist long after everyone involved has moved on. It looks like your name where it was always supposed to be, not because you shouted it into a room, but because you were patient enough to let the documentation speak. My mother understood that. She had built her whole professional life on that principle. She had also known before anyone else did that the greatest threat to something real is not conflict. It is the quiet decision to leave it out of the story. They had left me out of the story. They had left me out of the story. They had done it carefully, gradually, in language that sounded administrative. What they had not accounted for was that I had learned from the same person they had. I knew what records were for. I knew how to build a case the way I built software, methodically, without rushing, checking every dependency before moving forward. And I knew that when you do it right, when every element is in its correct place and the logic is clean, you don't need to raise your voice. The structure speaks for itself. If you have ever had something you built quietly removed from the record, something you gave time and precision and genuine effort to, and watched someone else accept credit for its existence, you know that the hardest part is not proving the truth. The hardest part is trusting that patience is not the same as passivity. It isn't. I promise you it isn't. You don't have to make a scene to make a correction. You don't have to destroy something to restore it. And you don't have to accept a version of your own history just because someone else wrote it first. Document everything. Stay precise. And when the moment comes, let the record speak. Because records, kept carefully, outlast every story someone else tries to tell about you. If this story reached something in you, take a moment in the comments to share what it brought up. And if you know someone who's fighting quietly to be seen in something they built, pass this along. Sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing someone else held the line. Thank you for listening.